for 15 years now.
And did you have to have any kind of special training or education to do that job?
Yes, prior to coming here, I graduated from Tulane Medical School in 1985, completed a residency in general surgery at the University of South Carolina in 1991, served as a general surgeon in the U.S. Navy from 91 to 95, then completed a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology at the University of Vermont in 1999, and a forensic pathology fellowship at the University of North Carolina in 2000. Following that, I served as a medical examiner in Phoenix, Arizona for approximately 2.5 years, then in Spokane, Washington for approximately 4.5 years before coming to Memphis.
And since you've been in Memphis, I think you said 15 years?
Yes,
And you've been chief medical examiner how long?
for about a year and a half now.
And have you testified as an expert in forensic pathology before?
Yes, I have,
How many times?
numerous times.
In this building?
Yes.
Okay. Mayor, at this point, I'd like to tender him as an expert in forensic pathology.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Thomas, any objections to the tender? Dr. Ross is an expert in this field, or any questions or Vordire regarding his qualifications?
No objection, no more doubt.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, the court is going to declare Dr. Marco Ross is an expert in this field of forensic pathology. As it indicated earlier, a person qualifies as an expert because of special skill, training, education, background, can in fact testify in the form of opinions and give you reasons for those opinions. And Dr. Ross will be able to testify in those opinion forms and give you background or reasons for those opinions. As the court has declared that he is in fact an expert in his field of forensic pathology. Mr. Schofield, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. As a part of your duties with the medical examiner's office, did you perform the autopsy on Lorenzen Wright?
Yes, I did.
Was this your typical kind of autopsy, or were there some challenges you don't usually see?
This was unusual and different in that the remains were so decomposed.
Okay, so the remains were very decomposed.
Yes.
Would this be typical of what you see, a body being out in the, exposed to the elements in July in Memphis?
Certainly, in a situation like that, bodies that remain outdoors for a week or longer can experience quite severe stages of decomposition and partial skeletonization as occurred in this case.
Okay. And did you have to do anything special or out of the ordinary when you were conducting this particular autopsy?
Well, in addition to making sure that we positively identified the remains, which was done by a dental odontologic examination, we also had to evaluate both by a relatively normal autopsy approach, which includes an examination of the body and all of its surfaces and contents. But in addition, in a case like this, we will usually try to remove remaining tissue on the bones if it's mostly skeletonized, as it was in this case, to evaluate the skeletal remains for evidence of a trauma, since the soft tissue evidence for potential trauma or disease is missing.
Okay. So you may have some soft tissue you can still examine, you may not, and that's why you have to take the further steps.
Yes.
And you also do x-rays of the body?
Yes.
Okay. And you did all these things in this case?
Yes, it did.
Did you, what defects did you note from the beginning or that caught your eye?
Initially, we noticed some defects of the remaining skin that was still attached to the skull, one of which, at least one of which corresponded to an actual defect in the skull, which we subsequently identified as a gunshot entrance wound. There were other defects of the scalp tissue that were related to underlying fractures of the skull as well.
Is it common when a skull is hit by a bullet that the skull will fracture in place?
Yes.
Except a high velocity projectile?
Yes.
Right? Okay. I'm going to pass forward some pictures and ask you to recognize these pictures. Your Honor, I've already shown these to defense counsel. I don't believe there's any objection.
Yes, sir.
No objection.
Mr. Thomas, thank you, sir.
If you could take a look at those pictures and describe them for us one by one, Doctor, and I'll move those into evidence, and then we'll talk about it.
We have a photograph of the upper half of the decomposed remains as we initially received them in the forensic center, or at least after we had removed the clothing. And then the second photograph shows a close-up of the head, showing some of the defects in the remaining scalp tissue on the skull. The third photograph shows the skull itself after the tissues and the skin have been removed from the skull in order to evaluate the injuries of the skull much more clearly. This one shows the left side of the skull. The next photograph shows the right side of the skull with a defect corresponding to a gunshot exit wound. The next photograph shows the underside or the bottom of the skull, showing a defect behind the area of the left ear. The next photograph shows a close-up of some of the decomposed tissue inside the chest cavity area where a bullet is located within that tissue. The next photograph is an x-ray taken at the time of autopsy. It's x-ray showing mainly some of the chest and shoulder area and showing the presence of 2 bullets in the chest region. The next photograph shows bullet fragments that were removed from the decedent's right arm. The next one shows, it's a photograph showing the bullets that were removed from the chest. And the next one is a photograph showing a bullet fragment or bullet jacket from inside the head of the deceased.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to commit those pictures into evidence.
Without objection, the court will admit as exhibit number 60. Photograph described by Dr. Ross as photograph of the upper half of the body of Lorenzen Wright, showing certain decomposure. Exhibit 60. Decomposing remains, I believe is the word that Dr. Ross used. Decomposed remains. Exhibit number 61. The photograph described to Dr. Ross as showing a close-up of the head skull area. Exhibit number 61. Exhibit number 62. Photograph of what is described by Dr. Ross of the skull after tissue and skin had been removed. Exhibit number 62. Exhibit number 63 is a photograph described by Dr. Ross as showing the left side of the skull. Exhibit 63. Exhibit 64. Photograph described by Dr. Ross as showing the right side of the skull. Possible exit wound. Exhibit 64. Exhibit number 65 is photograph described by Dr. Ross as showing the bottom of the skull.
photograph of the inside of the chest cavity area, showing some decomposed tissue and the bullet located in that tissue.
Exhibit number 65. Rephrase this for the record. Exhibit number 65 is a close-up of the chest area showing decomposed tissue with possible bullet fragments. That is exhibit number 65. Yes, sir.
Originally, I think you said 65 was the photo at the bottom of the skull. Are you?
Yes, sir. I may have misspoken. That's why I asked Dr. Ross for clarification. And what Dr. Ross has told me is the close-up area decomposed tissue of the chest with a possible bullet fragment. So that is 65. So I had it properly labeled, but I just did not describe it correctly. Exhibit 66. Photograph described by Dr. Ross is an X-ray of the chest area. Exhibit 66. Exhibit 67. Photograph showing bullet fragments from the right arm. Exhibit 67. Exhibit 68. Photographs described by Dr. Ross is showing bullets that were taken from the chest of the body of Lorenzen Wright. Exhibit 68, bullets from the chest. Exhibit number 69. Photographs showing what's been described by Dr. Ross's bullet jacket from head. Exhibit 69, bullet fragments from the head or jackets from the head. Mr. Schofield, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. And, Your Honor, due to our inability to get the digital laser pointer work, would it be all right if I had Dr. Ross step down and publish these to the jury so he can point out what we need to be looking at?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Ross, would you be comfortable with that?
Step down for the witness stand, please, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, jury, we have some issues with this system. As I said, it's a brand new system that we started using about 3 or 4 months ago, and apparently it's not working properly right now. So Dr. Ross is going to stand down in front of you and in front of the jury box to explain to you what has been shown in these photographs. If you need to move, please feel free to move closer to where Dr. Ross is. Some of these pictures may be a little bit unpleasant. Give you a heads up on that. But if you need to move to see the photographs, please feel free to move. Mr. Schofield, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to pass Dr. Ross previously marked as exhibit number 16. Dr. Ross, could you show that to the jury and explain to them what was significant about that picture?
This is a photograph showing the upper half of the remains of Mr. Wright after we had removed the clothing, and in it you can see mainly the skull, what's left of the skull on the top of the photograph, and then the chest and shoulder region are going to be in the lower portion of the photograph.
Right. And I know you described doing skeletal analysis, but it was true you were able to find some defects in the soft tissue.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to pass forward what's been previously marked as exhibit number 61. If you could explain to the jury what you photographed in that picture, Doctor.
This is a close-up of the previous photograph, and mainly in this area here that's kind of bordered by the ruler, you can see some defects in the decomposed scalp tissue that is still adherent to the skull in that area. And one of those defects does correspond to a defect that we found in the skull itself that is a gunshot entrance wound. The other defects correspond to fracture sites that were present in the skull as well.
So let me say this also, if you want to use that projector, if it's set up to be used, we can use it also.
It's
not set up. Yes, sir.
Sorry, we encourage us right to start with that.
Yes, sir.
Mark. And so I believe you testified at some point you removed the remaining soft tissue so you could examine the skeleton.
Yes.
I'm going to pass forward to marked as exhibit number 62. Could you explain to the jury what this is a picture of?
Okay. This is a photograph showing the left side of the skull after the skin and soft tissues have been removed. And you'll notice a defect towards the front part of the skull. That defect there is a gunshot entrance wound on the left frontoparietal skull. That's how that's described. In addition to that defect there, you'll notice towards the front area of the skull here, although you're seeing it from the side, a lot of the bones that would be present around the eyes and the nose are missing as well, because those have been fractured, and much of that bone is missing from the front part of the skull as well.
Pass Dr. Ross. This is previously marked as exhibit number 63. Dr. Ross, could you tell the jury about that?
Okay, this is a photograph showing the right side of the skull after the tissues and skin have been removed. And you'll see my finger is going to be right next to a defect that's sort of in the right temporal area of the skull. And that defect there is a gunshot exit wound on the skull.
Pass what's been previously marked as exhibit number 64.
This is a photograph of the base of the skull. So what we're doing is that we're actually kind of looking up at the bottom of the skull after, again, the tissues have been removed. And what you'll see is it's sort of the bottom left side of the skull. So the back of the skull is towards the top of the diagram. The front of the skull would be towards the bottom of the picture. This dark defect here on the edge is the foramen magnum. That's the part of the skull that sits on top of the spine. And then the area over here where this defect is, that's a defect that's just behind the mastoid process. The mastoid process, if you feel your ear, there's kind of a bony ridge just behind the ear. That's the mastoid process. And this defect right there is present just behind that mastoid process. That is another gunshot entrance wound. So that's a gunshot entrance wound, again, located on the left side of the skull, just behind the left ear. And that is an entrance wound that likely corresponds to the exit wound on the right side of the skull. The entrance wound I showed you previously in the left frontal part of the skull probably corresponds to the defect that we sort of see in the front of the skull.
Pass this one previously marked as exhibit number 65.
This is a photograph showing the inside of the chest and the all that gray-brown tissue that you see in there is just decomposed soft tissue inside the chest cavity. And within that decomposed tissue, just above the ruler, you'll see a little, I'll put my finger next to it, there is a bullet sitting within that tissue inside the chest.
That's the doctor previously marked exhibit number 66.
Okay, this is a photograph of an X-ray taken at the time of autopsy. Of course, because of the decomposed situation of the remains and the fact that the supporting soft tissue structure is no longer there. This does not look like your typical chest x-ray that you see in a more intact individual. But what you'll see in this x-ray is over towards the left side, you'll see, or rather the right side of the photograph, you'll see the spine. So this area here is the spine. This area here is actually just the shoulder. This would be his right shoulder that's just kind of off to the side because there's no longer any tissue supporting it. And then you can see all of the ribs that are in here. And again, I'll put my finger by one of them, but there are actually two whitish objects that you can see in the chest, and those are the bullets that are showing up on the x-ray. My finger is next to one of them. You can see the two bullets inside the chest cavity on this x-ray.
The last three is number 67, 68, and 69. If you could tell the jury what those items are.
This one is just a photograph showing some of the bullet fragments that we removed from his right arm. We did find in the right forearm area, just above the wrist area, there was a defect in the radius bone in that arm. And there's still some residual soft tissue in there. And we removed these bullet fragments from the soft tissue around the defect in that arm. So that corresponds to a gunshot wound to his right forearm. The next photograph shows the two bullets that we actually removed from the chest. So those were the two bullets that you saw on the x-ray, and also one of the bullets that you saw in that other photograph showing the decomposed chest tissue. So those are two bullets that we removed from the chest cavity. And we did find corresponding defects in the right collarbone, as well as in the right second rib, the left fourth rib, and the left eighth rib, that all had defects consistent with a gunshot wound. So at least some of those probably corresponded to those bullets. And the last photograph shows a bullet jacket, which is the sort of the metal covering on the surface of the bullet, and that was what was still remaining inside the skull at the time of autopsy. The rest of the bullet was no longer there. So this probably is one of those gunshot wounds that are in the head. What happens is the jacketing material gets stripped off the bullet and will stay left behind in the head, while the rest of the bullet will continue out the skull.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. You'll be seated on the witness stand. Thank you, sir.
Doctor talked earlier about doing a skeletal analysis, and you mentioned a little bit there.
So, do I understand that you examined the ribs and the chest area, the bones? Could you tell us about that?
Yes. After removing the tissues and examining those structures more closely, we showed that in addition to what we saw in the skull and which was seen in the photographs, there was also a defect in the right clavicle or right collarbone. There was a defect in the right second rib, which sort of sits almost just underneath the right clavicle. And those two defects, the nature of it was consistent with a bullet that probably traveled somewhat downward and from his front towards his back through the collarbone and the second rib. In addition, we found another defect on the left, the eighth rib, sort of on the outer part of the left eighth rib, that had, it was actually, the rib was sort of separated into two pieces. When you sort of put it back together, you could tell that there was a defect there that was consistent with a gunshot entrance wound through the outer part of the left eighth rib. In addition, the left fourth rib towards the front had two fractures not specific for a gunshot wound, but they were located near an area where on the shirt we saw a defect consistent with a bullet defect. So likely those two fractures are associated with a gunshot entrance wound somewhat towards the left front part of the chest. And lastly, as I described in the right forearm, in the radius, which is there are two bones, the radius and the ulna, but the radius is the one that sort of connects to the thumb side of your hand. And in the radius, just above the wrist area, there was a defect in the bone there that was also a gunshot entrance wound with the bullet fragments in the soft tissue that they showed.
So, summing up, you can say for sure there was at least 5 different bullets you can confirm due to the holes in the head, the 2 bullets actually found in the body, and the fragments in the arm.
That's correct.
I noticed in your report at the very end, in your summation, you also said that additional gunshot wounds could not be excluded. Why is that?
Again, because of the degree of decomposition of the body, the loss of the skin surfaces, which is usually our best tool for initially evaluating the presence of gunshot wounds or defects in the skin. Since that's no longer there, we're more dependent upon either bullets that we find residual within the remaining tissues and, of course, the skeletal defects as well.
Also, when people are brought in, they often brought in with their personal effects, clothes still on, things like that.
Yes.
Could you tell us what personal effects what Mr. Wright brought in?
The personal effects that he had on the remains when we examined them included a metal watch and a necklace that had 2 tags on it.
I guess it might be a little bit redundant at this point, but what was the manner of death?
The manner of death was certified as homicide.
And what was the cause of death?
Multiple gunshot wounds.
I'm not so sure.
Ms. Thomas or Mr. Perry, you may proceed.
No questions, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Dr. Ross, thank you for being present in court today. We'll excuse you from any additional testimony on this case. Know you got to go to work. And stay safe, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Lunch should be here or it's arriving shortly. Should be here. Ladies and gentlemen, your lunch should be arriving no later than 12:30. Might actually be in the building on the way to you. So we're going to stop now because it would not be appropriate to continue because your lunch should be here soon. Don't want it to be cold if it's hot. Don't want it to get mushy if it's cold. Remember the course instruction. Cannot discuss the case with anyone or amongst yourselves. And we'll resume at 1:45. Sorry, let me back up. At 1:45, in case your lunch gets here at 12:30, we'll resume at 1:45 this afternoon. I'll see you at 1:45. Thank you all. That should give you enough time to go outside, get some fresh air, maybe a better day than it was yesterday. Okay, I know for the media folks, for the record, the jury is out. The media folks were not able to see those photographs, were not able to get them published. Is there anything I can do that would assist you in doing your job?
More heads up, I guess when, I don't think they'll come back, but if there's going to be more photos, just a heads up, we can plan. But we're able to stay off the photos, especially if they're not on the projector.
Understand. So the ones who are not projectors, or anything I can do that would help you to do your job if you have any interest in those photographs?
Oh, you never get them. I don't know.
You never get them.
Can I ponder that for a second?
Yes, ma'am. And if need be, we can have them published on the screen, and before we start, you can take whatever photographs or whatever feed you need from that screen. Okay?
So potentially before we restart after lunch?
Yes, ma'am.
So can we get in with enough time to do that?
We'll have you in before we bring the jury in. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
At least 5 minutes?
At least 5 minutes. He's found. Jury is out. Anything else we need to address before we take a recess? What time did I say that, clerk?